It all started on a quiet Thursday afternoon. I was cleaning the living room, the kind of day when the sun streams in just right, hitting the dust motes that dance less in the air. The scent of lemon polish mixed with old books filled the room. I was humming softly to myself, moving cushions and straightening picture frames, when the front door opened, letting in that familiar creak and the faint smell of my daughter's husband, Tom. He had that new workout gal smell today, mixed with the lingering aroma of the city outside. He had just come back from an errand downtown. "Hey, Mom," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe, holding a grocery bag. His tone was light, but there was a kind of pause in his voice, like he was weighing whether to ask something he had been thinking about. I smiled and motioned for him to come in. As he put the bag on the counter, I noticed him looking around the room differently than he usually did. Noticing the little details I always assumed he ignored: the crooked lampshade, the tiny pile of magazines by the sofa, the small cracks in the coffee table. "You always notice everything," he said almost to himself. Then he straightened and asked me something that caught me completely off guard. "Mum, do you ever feel I don't know, like you're holding back a part of yourself, something you've never really shared?" I froze mid-wipe of the duster. There was a tension in his voice, not awkward, but deep, almost urgent. It wasn't the kind of question someone asks casually. It wasn't small talk, and yet there was something profoundly respectful in the way he asked, like he was giving me permission to speak without judgment. I put the duster down and motioned for him to sit on the sofa. "I suppose I have," I admitted slowly. "I think we all do in some ways." "Why do you ask?" He shifted, fingers drumming lightly on the bag he had set down. "I don't know. Lately, I feel like life's too short to carry things around quietly, and sometimes talking about them with someone who really listens. It makes all the difference." That simple admission opened something inside me I hadn't realized I'd been holding on to. There was a strange intimacy in the air, not romantic, but tender in a way that startled me. The kind of moment that feels like two souls brushing against each other's truths, even when you're bound by family and respect. I realized then that this wasn't just a conversation. It was an opening, a rare, fragile chance to explore something deeper with someone I trusted. The room felt warmer somehow, the sunlight more vivid against the faded floral curtains. I found myself speaking honestly, telling him about my regrets, my small triumphs, the quiet fears I never voiced because they seemed too insignificant. And Tom listened, not just hearing me, but really listening, nodding occasionally, his eyes never leaving mine. By the time I paused, a calm had settled over us both. It was the kind of silence that isn't empty, it's full, alive with understanding, and I knew in that moment that something had shifted between us, and perhaps inside me, too. After that afternoon, the house felt different, lighter somehow. I couldn't quite explain it, but every time I walked past the living room, the sunlight streaming through the blinds seemed sharper, the dust motes dancing more like they were celebrating something. Tom had left an hour earlier, but his question lingered in my mind, echoing softly. "Do you ever feel like you're holding back a part of yourself?" The next few days, I found myself noticing things I hadn't before, a creaking in the floorboards that reminded me of childhood afternoons spent tiptoeing through my parents' home, the way the curtains swayed in the late afternoon breeze, carrying the faint smell of the garden outside. Even my own voice seemed different when I read aloud from a book, more deliberate, more willing to reach out and touch the corners of my own feelings. Then, one evening, Tom stopped by again. He was carrying a small box of chocolates, his expression casual, but with that same quiet intensity in his eyes. "I thought you might like these," he said, handing them over. "No reason, just wanted to see you." I laughed softly, tucking the box onto the coffee table. "You're spoiling me," I said, though I didn't mean it in the material sense. There was something comforting in his presence, a steady warmth that reminded me of long conversations with old friends when time slows down and you forget to check your watch. We sat together in silence for a while, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of traffic outside. And then, almost hesitantly, he spoke. I've been thinking about what I asked the other day about holding back parts of ourselves. Sometimes I think we hide things, not because we're ashamed, but because we're afraid someone won't really understand. I nodded slowly, feeling my throat tighten with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Yes, I whispered exactly that. It was in that moment I realized how much I had craved being seen, really seen for more than the surface parts of my life, the cooking, the cleaning, the small social niceties I performed automatically. Tom wasn't judging, wasn't trying to fix anything. He was simply present, creating a space where I could unfold without fear. We started talking quietly at first about things that seemed trivial, books we liked, memories of the city he grew up in, my own recollections of childhood summers. But slowly the conversation deepened. We shared small regrets, subtle longings, things I had tucked away even from my own daughter. And in those moments, the house seemed to shrink around us, becoming more intimate, more alive, as if it too wanted to listen. By the time he left that evening, I felt a strange mixture of anticipation and calm. Something was shifting inside me, something tender but insistent, a spark of self-discovery I hadn't expected. I realized that connection, genuine connection, doesn't always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quietly through a look, a question, or simply being there when someone dares to speak their truth. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was no longer holding back, not because life demanded it, but because I wanted to. The days that followed felt suspended, like I was walking in a soft haze of awareness. Tom's visit had left a subtle mark on me, and I found myself noticing everything more sharply. The way the sunlight painted golden stripes across the rug, the faint smell of jasmine from the garden drifting in through the open windows, the rhythmic tick of the old wall clock that had always been in the living room but suddenly felt like a heartbeat I could feel. It was a Saturday morning when he stopped by again. He didn't knock this time. He just let himself in with that easy confidence that came from years of knowing me as family, yet somehow stepping into a new, delicate space between us. "I thought you might like some company," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. His tone was light, but there was that quiet intensity in his eyes again. We moved to the sofa, and I poured us each a cup of tea, the steam curling in soft spirals above the cups. The quiet was comfortable, like a well-worn blanket that somehow smelled of warmth and trust. We began talking about the small things at first, recipes we loved, movies we remembered from decades ago, but soon the conversation drifted to more personal terrain. "You know," Tom said softly, tracing the rim of his cup with a finger, "I've always admired how you hold this home together, but I wonder, do you ever think about what you really want? Not for anyone else, just for you." This question hit me unexpectedly, and I found myself hesitating. I realized I had spent so many years moving through life for others, my children, my friends, my work, that I barely remembered my own longings. My heart beat a little faster, not with fear, but with a strange excitement. I don't know, I admitted honestly. I suppose I've been afraid to even ask myself that. Tom nodded, his gaze soft but unwavering. It's okay to be afraid, but sometimes just asking the question can open doors you didn't know existed. And in that moment, I felt something shift inside me. A part of me that had been quiet, hidden beneath routine and obligation, stirred awake. I began to share things I hadn't spoken aloud in years, dreams I'd set aside, the books I had longed to write, the places I had wanted to visit but never dared. And Tom listened, really listened, not interrupting, not judging, just holding space for my words to breathe. The more I spoke, the more alive I felt. The tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying started to melt, replaced by a gentle warmth, a sense of being seen and understood in a way I hadn't experienced in decades. And as the afternoon sunlight slanted across the room, catching in the fine lines of his face, I felt a connection that was tender, respectful, and profoundly human. We didn't rush anything. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic confessions, Just quiet moments of recognition, laughter at small memories, and the kind of conversation that sinks into your bones and makes you feel less alone in the world. By the time he left that day, I felt as though I had discovered a hidden part of myself, a corner of my heart that had been waiting quietly for someone to acknowledge it. That evening, as I walked through the living room, the sun dipping behind the trees outside, I realized that my home didn't feel like just a place anymore. It felt like a witness, a companion to my awakening. And somehow, in sharing these quiet, vulnerable moments with Tom, I had begun to rediscover not only myself, but the subtle beauty of connection, the kind that doesn't shout, but whispers and lingers long after it's gone. The weeks asked gently, almost imperceptibly, but each encounter with Tom left its mark. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic revelations. It was the small things, the quiet moments of understanding, the way our conversations lingered long after he had gone. I began to notice a new rhythm in my days, a subtle lightness in my step, a soft patience in the way I moved through the house. One afternoon, I was rearranging books on the living room shelves, the afternoon sun painting warm stripes across the carpet. Tom arrived carrying a small notebook. "I thought we could share something," he said, a little shy. "Just a little project if you're interested." I smiled in trade and we settled on the sofa with tea, the quiet comfort of the room wrapping around us like a familiar shore. We began writing thoughts, reflections, dreams we had tucked away. It felt strangely intimate, not in a physical sense, but in the way our thoughts intertwined, the way our words filled spaces that had once been silent. As we wrote, I realized something profound. This connection with Tom wasn't about desire in the conventional sense. It was about recognition, about two people honoring each other's inner lives, about creating a space where vulnerability could exist without fear. And in that space, I discovered courage I hadn't realized I possessed. The courage to embrace my own story, my own truths, without hiding them from the world. Later that evening, after Tom had left, I sat in the living room, the fading light spilling across the furniture, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. For the first time in years, I felt fully present in my own life. I thought about the question he had asked that day. Do you ever feel like you're holding back a part of yourself? I realized that I had been holding back not out of shame, but out of habit. And now, gently, quietly, I was letting those parts of myself breathe. I understood then that connection, the kind that touches the heart, doesn't always arrive loudly or dramatically. Sometimes it comes softly, like a breeze brushing against your skin, subtle but undeniable. And when it does, it has the power to change the way you see yourself and the world around you. As the night settled in and the house grew quiet, I poured myself a final cup of tea and sat by the window. The stars were beginning to blink awake, distant and steady, and I realized that just like the stars, certain moments in life shine quietly, but their light lasts far longer than you might expect. That evening, I didn't feel alone. I felt seen, understood, and alive in a way I hadn't in years. And I knew without doubt that the unexpected connection I had discovered with Tom had opened a door not just between us, but within myself. A door to authenticity, to courage, and to the quiet joy of being truly present in my own life. And for the first time in a long time, I welcomed